Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Nun Zayin. Today's stuff is sponsored by Diane Kusher in honor of her granddaughter Katriel celebrating her bat mitzvah this past Shabbat in Sydney. Mazal tov. Okay, we're going to get started with Rabbi Ami's statement at the bottom of yesterday's daf, and we're going to get a little bit off on a tangent into Hilchot Shabbat. So we saw that Rabbi Ami said that if you put the leavening agent into the dough, and then you just walked away, you're liable for leavening the dough because you put the leavening agent in the dough and it causes it to happen on its own, but it doesn't just happen on its own. It happened because you put it there. So now, and he says basically it's just like in Shabbat. If you put something on coals and it cooks, you're going to be chayav. The problem is, the Gemara asks, Maaseh Shabbat at the bottom of Nivaf Amabed, Ki agavna mi mechayev. Are you liable for just putting meat on coals? Didn't Rabbi Yochanan quote Rabbi Yochanan as saying, if you put meat on coals, you're only going to be liable if you flipped it. If you didn't flip it, you're not liable. So Amar Rava, my chayav nami dekamal kemaset sali shel Shabbat. Rava says, when we said you're liable, we said you're reliable the same way you're reliable for the maaset sli of Shabbat. Okay, now this is a very unclear statement, what this means exactly. But if you take, we'll go with one of the interpretations. If you take Shabbat, right, and what you did is you basically put it on, and then you flip it over. Now, when you flip it over, you didn't actually fully cook it, right? What happened? It continued to cook on its own. So same thing applies in our case. If you put a leavening agent onto a dough, it will rise, okay? Now, in that case, you don't really need to flip it. It's not going to help if you flip it or not flip it. With the meat, you're going to need to flip it because the heating element is on the bottom, and if you don't flip it, the top part's not going to cook, although we're going to see exactly what the scenario is. We're going to get in depth into the statement of Rabbi Yochanan in one more minute, do a gufa, and say, let's understand this a little better. But the idea being that if you didn't flip it, it wouldn't cook all the way, but once you flip it, you don't actually fully cook it, right? It just continues to cook. It doesn't cook at that moment. It cooks further, like later on, because of your action. That's the same thing here. Okay, now we're going to go and understand better this statement of Rabbi Yochanan and in what case was he really talking about. So Gufa, Amar Rabbi Barbachan, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Hinech basar gabei gachalim v'hipech bo chayav, lo hipech bo patur. Okay, that's just a quote of the statement he made that we just read. Hey chidami, what is the case? Now, if you say, if you didn't flip it, it's not going to cook. Well, pshita, obviously, I don't need Rabbi Yochanan to tell me that. If it won't cook if I don't flip it, then of course I'm not liable. Now, also, if I don't flip it, it would have cooked anyway. Like, let's have a really thin piece of meat. All it needs to cook is on one side. The heat will go through and get to the other side. Amay lo mechayev. I should not be chayav if I didn't flip it. So it can't be that case and it can't be that case. So what's left? Lo tzricha di lo hapichbe havabashale mitzad echad k'machal ben Drosai. If I didn't flip it, it would have cooked on one side like the machal ben Drosai. You remember ben Drosai? He was known to be a bandit and he would eat on the run all the time and he would cook his meat only a third of the way. There's machloket exactly how much, but most people say around a third of the way. It's not fully cooked, but it's enough to be cooked to be considered bishul for Shabbat, for it to be chayav for the malacha of bishul. So they say, if I wouldn't have flipped it, then it would have cooked like macha ben Drosai, meaning it wouldn't have fully cooked; it would only partially have cooked. But only on one side. Okay, so without flipping, I would have gotten not to completely cooked on one side. I would have gone to partially cooked on one side, but partially cooked enough that theoretically someone could eat it, even though most people don't eat their meat at that level of cooking. If I flipped it, now when I flip it, what did I do? I enabled it to cook a third of the way on the other side. So kamashmalan, what's it teaching us? To call mitzad echad k'machal ben Drosai lo klumhu. What it's teaching us is that if I didn't flip it, it would only have cooked a third of the way on one side. That I wouldn't have been obligated for. If it had cooked completely on one side, I would be obligated. But cooking partially on one side, I'm not obligated. Okay, but partially on both sides, I would be obligated. I'm a Rava. Now Rava continues and he says some halacha. We're going to have two versions of how to understand Rava. V'im nitzlebo kigrogeret mitzad echad b'makom echad chayav. He says, if when you cook that meat, there was an amount that was the size of a fig. Okay, remember in shiurim we always compare to foods. There's kazayit and olive bulk, there's kibetza and egg. This is another shiur that comes up in certain situations of a size of a fig. Now, if I roasted the size of a fig of the meat on one side, b'makom echad, in one location, chayav. So basically what they're going to darshan here is he said in one place, which sounds like if I did a few places in the piece of meat and altogether it added up to one fig, I wouldn't be obligated because only if it's b'makom echad. On that, they're going to raise a difficulty from a different issue in Hilchot Shabbat. Amale Ravina leRavashi b'makom echad im b'shnayim or shlosha makomot lo. Right? Sounds like he's saying only if it's in one place, not if it was a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there. They won't combine. Remember, we always talk about combining. So if I have a piece of meat with a little cooked here, a little cooked there, a little cooked there, all together, I have a fig bulk, I'm not going to be obligated unless they're all together. That's what it seems like they're saying, like Rava said. And Ravina questions that. He goes to Ravash and he says, that's what Rava says. But that goes against a Mishnah when we're talking about laws of building on Shabbat. We're going to compare laws of cooking to laws of building. V'hatnan, hakoder kol shu chayav. If you drill a hole, any small hole, any amount, you're liable. Hechidami, what's the case? If we say you drilled one hole, there was a teeny amount that was in one spot. Okay, what are you going to do with a teeny hole? It's like, almost nothing. You're not going to be liable for building. Elalav, it must be when it says any small amount that you drilled, you're liable for. It must be b'shnayim or shlosha makomot. It must have been you drilled a little hole here, a little hole there, a little hole there. The way they used to drill holes, apparently, according to the way the commentary says, they would drill a little hole, a little hole, a little hole near each other, and then they would combine them to a bigger hole. So it must mean a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there, in a way that they could be combined. Okay? And then, what do you see here? Right? If you could take a kolshu, and once they get to a hole that's sizable, enough of a size, it doesn't exactly say what the size is for a hole to be significant, but as long as it becomes significant in the end, then you're liable. But here it sounds like in food, it wouldn't be the case. Roasting it a little here, a little there, a little there, you wouldn't say, well, you can eat that and eat that and eat that and end up having an olive bulk, it's not just eating, we're talking about bishul, but, in the end, you cooked a fig bulk. Who cares whether it's, separate spots? To which they answer, lo olam b'makom echad. You completely misunderstood that Mishnah. The Mishnah that said kolshu was not talking about 2 or 3 places, and then there's no difficulty. Because the Mishnah was talking about really a kolshu. Yeah, you might say, what does that have any, right, no. What, if you drilled a teeny hole, what's it going to be used for? Oh, no, we have a good use for a teeny hole. Dechazu lekacha da'aklida. Okay, it says bava, it should be kacha. Kacha is a tooth. Okay, it could be there's a way to understand bava. Also, bava is usually a door. But kacha da'aklida is the teeth of the key. Aklida, like in Hebrew, makledet is a keyboard. Okay, it comes from laklid is to type. Anyway, aklida is the key. So now we're going to say, the teeth of the key can go, right, when you use, right, you need a teeny hole for the teeth to fit into. That is what you're liable for, a teeny hole, if it can be used as something. In other words, this goes back to Masechet Shabbat, if you remember. I'll give you an example, where different things have different shiurim, like you're chayav for carrying on Shabbat, okay? If you carry something of significance, now depending on what the item is, there's a different amount, a requisite amount of what is significant. So from here you see that it really depends on what the use is and what the malacha is. So for boneh, a little teeny hole could actually be used for something. And then this has nothing to do with our topic because it's not talking about in one place or a few separate places, right? We're not talking about a few separate places, which we thought contradicted what Rava said. That was the whole first version of Rava. Now we're going to have the second version of Rava, and we call this like a mirror image sugya. Because Ika da Amre, I'm a Rava, you'll see in a minute, Afilu b'shnayim or shlosha makomot. The Rava didn't say b'makom echad. Rava said, as long as you cooked a fig, it doesn't matter the size of a fig. Again, we're talking about meat, not figs, right? We're talking about cooking your meat. The amount of meat that you cooked was the size of a fig. that can add up from 2 or 3 places. To which, what are they going to do now in the mirror image sugya? They're going to say, Amrle Ravina le Ravashi. In this case, Ravina said to Ravashi, Av Ananami Tanina, I'll prove this to you from a Mishnah, what Rava said. I'll bring support for what he said rather than a contradiction. And then he says, and now it's going to be the same thing, just brought as a proof rather than a contradiction. HaKodech kol shu chayav. And hechidami, what's the case where you're going to drill a teeny little hole and be chayav? Ilema b'makom achad kol shu l'may chazi. If you're talking about one hole in one place, what on earth are you going to do with a hole that's teeny? El alav, it must be b'shnayim u'shlosham kamot echaz eletzeruv, because then you can combine the 3 together to get to a real amount. To which they say, no, this is not a proof at all for what Rava said, because the olam b'makom echad echazu l'kachad eklida. You could say, no, this is all just for the teeth of a key, and bona is completely different than roasting meat. Okay, and therefore the shear for building is different from cooking. So that was all a complete tangent where we got off our topic because we started with the leavening, and how the leavening, you don't actually you could actively be kneading it and causing it to rise, but usually, or you could just stick it in, it'll cause it to rise on its own, and you'll be liable, okay, for doing this to the mincha offering. Okay, whereas it's just like a Masechet Shabbat, and then we had to understand exactly which cases a Masechet Shabbat you chayav, but it seems like just like a Masechet Shabbat where you, as long as you get it to a certain level, right, a third, and then flipped it and got it to a third of the way, even though most of the action wasn't really from, you did something and then it actually happened on its own, you're going to be liable. You're going to be liable here as well. And then we just got into what exactly was the case there, and then we got into the statement of Rava, which he either said one thing or he said something different, and we brought this source to either contradict or to support. Okay, now, and either which way, we resolved the contradiction or rejected the support. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're back to our topic, and we're going to darshan from here till the end of today's stuff. It's going to be mostly focused on this one pasuk. Okay, we're going to get off a little bit on other things, but we're going to darshan actually 2 psukim. It's the pasuk about lo te'aseh chametz. So it's in Vayikra Bet Yud Aleph. Kol mincha asher takrivu laHashem, all minchas that you sacrifice to God. Okay, now by the way, this is actually in the context of one of the menachot that are the voluntary menachot, called the minchat marcheshet, which is in a deep pan. Lo te'aseh chametz, you cannot make them chametz. Ki kol seor v'chol dvash lo taktiru mimenu isha laHashem. Because any seor or dvash, right, any leavening agent or honey is not permitted to be burned from it as an isha laHashem on the fire to God. Okay, you're not allowed to burn leavened items. You're not allowed to burn honey. If you haven't listened yet to Din and Daf about chametz, also Mirav Tubakan in Hebrew, in Sugya B'Ktana also has a shir on the idea of the leaven and all that, and why this is. You can listen to both and compare and see what each one brings, if the Hebrew is good enough. Otherwise, we have Din and Daf. What's this idea of chametz being so bad? Okay, now, but we're not focused on that right now. Right now, we're focused on this pasuk and different drashot on the pasuk. So we're going to start with the Braita, Tanu Rabbanan. Ilu ne'emal asher takrivu laHashem lo te'aseh chametz, meaning if it skipped the words kol hamincha. I'm thinking of the game bingo, right? When that song bingo where you skip a word each time, right? If we had skipped the first 2 words in the pasuk, and you had just said asher takrivu laHashem lo te'aseh chametz, the things that you're going to sacrifice to God, it didn't say kol hamincha. And you know we're talking about a mincha because the context is the mincha. But what's the context? The mincha marcheshet. Okay, so now hayiti omer ein li ela. Okay, but actually we're going to get to that in a minute, not yet. But if you didn't have the words kol and you didn't have the words hamincha, what would you have said? Okay, let's focus right now not on the word kol, all, but just mincha. If you didn't have the word mincha, what might you have thought? What part do you sacrifice to God of the mincha? The kometz. So you might have thought, remember what you do. You have the dough, then you take out the kometz, and then you burn that on the altar. So you might have thought the prohibition to make a chametz, en li ala lo te'aseh chametz, ala kometz bilvad. Maybe it's only on the kometz, which is going to be yakrivu. Yakrivu is future, that you will sacrifice to God. The only part you sacrifice is the kometz. Mincha minayin. How do we know that if you leaven the whole dough before you take the kometz out, you're also chayav? Talmud Lamal, mincha. Okay, the word mincha is generally the word used for the whole batch before you take the kometz out, right? If we think about the terms we've learned, there's the mincha, which is the whole thing. Then there's the kometz, and you're left with the shirayim, right? The remainder. So the word mincha comes to include the whole batch of dough, you're liable. Sha'ar menachot minayi. Now we get to the other part. What's the word kol coming for? How do we know other menachot and not just the minchat marcheshet? Or maybe not just the minchat nedavas that are like the minchat marcheshet. But what about the obligatory minchas and all that? Talmud lamar kol mincha. Okay, so there the word kol, all, comes to say all menachot. Asher takrivu laHashem. Now we focus on the word. So far we focused on kol and mincha. Now we focus on the word laHashem. Well, who else are you going to sacrifice to if not to God? So what does it mean? What do we learn from the word laHashem? Kshera velo psula. It's only relevant. Okay, here we're limiting the prohibition. You're only liable for leavening a kosher offering. Mikan amru, what does it mean kosher? It means mikan amru hamechametz et hakshera chayav et hapsula patur. If your korban was disqualified, for example, I'll give you an example that we're going to use in a minute. Let's say I took the mincha out of the temple courtyard. If I take it out of the temple courtyard, I disqualify it. It can't be used anymore. Remember, it's kosher kochim. Once you put it in that sanctified vessel, it can't leave the temple. If I let the temple courtyard, if I took it out of the temple courtyard, it's disqualified. If I now leaven it, I'm not liable because it's only things that could in the future be brought to be sacrificed. Okay, not only the komets, but even the whole mincha, right? Because eventually we'll take some of it from there and sacrifice. But if the mincha was taken outside and disqualified, well, there's no prohibition. This is going to lead us to a question of Rav Papa, which I would call a Rabbi Yirmiyah style question. Comes Rav Papa and he asks, by Rav Papa, Chimtza v'yatzat v'chazar v'chimtza mahu. Okay, you're going to have to think about why this is a question. What if I leavened it, then I took it out of the courtyard, and then I leavened it again? Am I liable or not? Now, why would there be a question? So he's going to explain. Kevan diyatzat, the obvious would be to say, well, since I took it out, it's now disqualified. Right? If remember, we learned yesterday that if you leaven it at the earlier part and then you leaven it again later at another stage, you're going to be liable for both. But in this case, in the in-between stage, you actually, after you leavened it the first time, by let's say you kneaded it and leavened it that way, then you took it outside and then you continually, did something else to it and let it rise, right? You helped it to rise. Now, what's the issue? The issue is that you already took it out in the middle and it was disqualified, so you're not going to be liable for that second stage. Oh, here comes the or, which is a creative way of thinking. Dilma kevan dechimtza psul yotze lo mahanebe. Now, wait a minute. When you took it out, did you disqualify the offering? No, because it was already disqualified when you leavened it in the beginning. When you leavened that dough, you disqualified it. So now that I took it outside, it doesn't mean, it's not like a regular offering that was perfectly great and then I took it outside. We basically ignore that stage completely because that stage is an irrelevant stage because it was already disqualified. It doesn't mean anything to take it out once it's already disqualified. So if I then took it out and I leavened it more, actually I might be liable because now this is interesting. There's different kinds of disqualifications. There's a psul, like yotze and things like that, where I completely disqualify the offering. Or there's, I leavened it. Now, if I leavened it, that's not called a disqualification that precludes me from another leavening, because we already learned that in yesterday's daf, that even though I ruined it by leavening it, if I continually leaven it, I'm going to be liable again. So, therefore, that's not a disqualification that says, okay, basically you're not going to be liable for leavening. So if I did in between those two stages, I took it out, do we say I disqualified it now? Or do we say it's not disqualified because it was already ruined because it was leavened in the stage one? And then we ignore that, and then we just go to a regular case of mechametz achar mechametz, where you're actually liable. So that's what he says, right? V'chi hadar mechametz le mechayev ala mishum mechametz achar mechametz. Okay, so maybe I am liable then. Well, the answer is teiku. We don't have an answer. We don't know how we look at this. By Rav Mary. Chimtza, he now has another question, which is going to end in teiku. This is Rav Mary's question. Chimtza v'rosho mizbeach mahu. Now the pasuk says asher takrivu, which means that you will offer in the future. What if I offered it already? If I offered it already and then leavened it, okay, let's say while it was burning on the flame or something, I offered it. I'm not liable because I already did the mitzvah. I already sacrificed it. So it doesn't matter what I do to it after that. But what if I put it on the altar? Now, we've seen this before. The putting on the altar, to a certain extent, is as if I already burned it, okay? Because la'akriv is to bring close. So la'akriv is also to burn, right? It has different meanings. But there's this idea, and at the end of the sugya today, we're going to talk about what if you put something on a ramp. But right now, we're in a different context. But is putting on the ramp like putting on the altar? But here we're saying putting on the altar is like burning it, perhaps. So do we say asher takrivu amar Rachman levaha says, right, that you will bring to the altar and offer on the altar. You already offered it on the altar. Now again, you didn't burn it, but you did put it on the altar, so maybe you're no longer liable for leavening it. Oh, Dilma, mechusar tarak, mechusar masedami, or do we say no? Until you burn it, it's missing the important action, in which case you're still at the stage of before it was offered, and therefore you'll be liable. And the Gemara answers again, we don't have an answer to this question. Okay, now we're going to go back to this drasha. We started with, we took this pasuk, kol we darshaned, all menachot. Mincha we darshaned, we said, mincha includes the dough before you take the komets. La Hashem means not disqualified offerings. What words didn't we darshan? Asher tekrivu. So they now ask, V'hasha denafkale mikol mincha asher tekrivu la Hashem lamali. Okay, and they're really focusing not on the words la Hashem because we already darshaned it, but asher tekrivu. What do we need this for? Okay, and once we include all mincha, and really all mincha means not just asher tekrivu. Asher tekrivu sounds like just the komets. So what are the words asher tekrivu coming for? Lamali. We need it for the following drasha. Asher tekrivu. Okay, we're going to have a machloket, Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Akiva, and then we're going to have a debate about who says what. Okay, or an issue with who says what, and we're going to end up switching who says what. We're going to start off saying like this. L'rabot minchat nisachim lechimutz. Divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Rabbi Akiva omer l'rabot lechem apanim lechimutz. Now, according to this braita, each one includes another case. Now, the minchas we were talking about there were the minchas where you have some part that gets offered and some part that doesn't, right? Now we're going to talk about minchas that either you burn the whole thing, which is the minchat nisachim, or you burn none of it, which is the lechem apanim. Those two offerings are kind of unique in the sense that we either offer the whole thing or we offer none of it, and it's not similar at all to the minchat marcheshet that was mentioned in that pasuk. So you need the words asher yakrivu, which is brought as a sacrifice, which is an offering, you could call it, that's going to include either the minchat nisachim, according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, or the lechem apanim, according to Rabbi Akiva, that if you leaven those, you will be liable. Now the big question is, why does each one not think both, right? Why wouldn't we say both are included? So Rashi helps us out with that. We're going to see it later on in the sugya, but maybe it's worth bringing up already right now. So first of all, Rashi says, if you look at minchat nisachim lechimutz, it's the last Rashi on the page, it's a little bit long, l'rabot minchat nisachim lechimutz, she'im chimtza chayav, mishum dahain kra gabe shar menachot sheshirehem nechalim k'tiv. And it says, Rashi says, as I mentioned before, because the pasuk is talking about a case where the part is burned and the remainder is eaten. And therefore they had this thought that maybe it's only referring to them. Okay, if you skip down, he then says, the one who says, lavim minchat nisachim, okay, aval lechem apanim lo lak, why wouldn't you be lashes for lechem apanim for chimutz? Dekasavar midat yavesh lo nitkacha. Okay, this is something we're going to see later in the Gemara, and we'll see what the source is for it. But that the lechem apanim was put only, there was no oil added to it, which means that you don't really have to mix it. It doesn't have a Torah commandment to mix with oil, like in other places. And it was only really, the only vessel it went in was the measuring vessel. Now the measuring vessel was measuring how much, what are you measuring only? The solet, that's the only real ingredient. Besides you add some water, but it's really just the solet. There's no measurement for the water. So you put the solet in the vessel, and then you just mix the water in. Now there's a machloket whether the dry ingredient measuring cups in the temple were sanctified or not. If you say they weren't sanctified, then the lechem apanim wasn't sanctified, in which case there's no problem to leaven it, because there's no prohibition to leaven it, because the prohibition is to leaven something that's sanctified. And when does it get sanctified, the lechem apanim? When you bake it in the oven. The oven becomes the klei sharet that sanctifies it. So if you hold that the midare yavesh didn't sanctify, then that dough is never sanctified until the baking. And once it's baked, well, there's no prohibition to leaven anymore. It's done. Okay? That's the opinion that says it's the nisachim that it includes and not the lechem apanim. Now, if you didn't understand this fully, we're going to see this all inside soon. Now, if you say Okay, the midah, if you say, aval Menachot Nesachim lo lake, Rashi continues on the next page, Demei Perot e machmitzim. Well, the Menachot Nesachim was different than all the others, because if you remember, there's either 3-to-1 ratio of oil to now it's a little tricky to say 3-to-1. It's 3 log to 1 isaron, or 2 log to 1 isaron, right? There were 4-to-2 or 6-to-3, and it depends whether you have a keves, an ayil, or a par. Anyway, the point being, if you don't remember all those details, but there was a lot of oil, which means you don't really need water. And if you don't need water, and we're going to see this inside in a second, if you don't need water, then and you just have oil, well, water is what causes it to become leavened, not oil. Oil is like mei perot. It's like fruit juice. It's something that doesn't really leaven, which means there's no prohibition to leaven them because it won't ever leaven anyway. Like you don't have to watch it from leavening because oil and flour will just not leaven. Okay? So that's why you would say lechem hapanim is the one included and not that. Okay, we're going to get into this whole debate as we go on. I just thought maybe it was worth bringing it up in the beginning. So the first question is exactly this question that I just said, which is Menachot Nesachim mei perotem. But wait, the Menachot Nesachim have so much oil, they don't have water in them, and therefore mei perot e machmitzim. Well, mei perot doesn't, right? If anything that's not water doesn't leaven. So how could you say there's a prohibition to leaven? It'll never become leavened anyway. So Amar Rish Lakish, okay, Rabbi Yossi Aglili was the one who adds in this opinion that it's the Menachot Nesachim. Omer haya Rabbi Yossi Aglili Menachot Nesachim megabla b'mayim ukshecha. Rish Lakish says it must be Rabbi Yossi Aglili. Okay, at the top of Amud Bet now. Rabbi Yossi Aglili says Menachot Nesachim you mix with water if you want, and it's fine. Meaning, there's this machloket. Can you add water, or is it forbidden to add water? Now, some say that there's only oil, and because there's so much oil, you don't need water, and you can't add water. The only reason to add water is if you need it, and here you don't need it, you're not allowed. But if you say, well, you can if you want, then in comes the prohibition. Well, you can add water, but make sure not to leaven it, and if you do leaven it, you will get lashes. So you have to assume that Rabbi Yossi Aglili must hold, that's what Rish Lakish says, must hold that the Menachot Nesachim, you could add water if you wanted. It wouldn't ruin it, and that's why there's prohibition against leavening. Now, soon we're going to switch the Shitot, and then the Gemara never comes back to this, but you'd have to say it's Rabbi Akiva, not Rabbi Yossi Aglili who says this. Lechem hapanim. Okay, so that was the question on Rabbi Yossi Aglili. How can you say that there's a prohibition to leaven the Menachot Nesachim if there's so much oil in it that you'd ever add water and then there's no issue? Well, you could add water is the answer. Here's the question of Rabbi Akiva, though, which is going to cause us a big problem. Lechem hapanim midat yaveshi. V'shamana leRabbi Akiva da'amar midat yavesh lo nitkadshana. They're quoting a Mishna later on in Daf Tzadi, in Menachot, that says that according to Rabbi Akiva, the dry measurements in the temple were never sanctified. Well, if Rabbi Akiva is the one who says that, then Rabbi Akiva can't say that the lechem hapanim, there's a prohibition to leaven it, because it's what I said before. If you say the dry measuring ingredients were never sanctified, then you say that when you measure that flour, it doesn't become sanctified. And when does it become sanctified? Only when you bake it. Okay? Now, you might say, well, flour doesn't go straight on the altar. You have to mix it with something. Maybe you mixed it in a bowl, right? Normally, what do? You mix it in a bowl with the oil, because Torah says you have to mix it. So you put it in this bowl, and the bowl is called a bisa, and it's a klei sharet, and it becomes sanctified in the bowl. But in the case of this, you don't need the bowl. Now, we'll get back to later. What do you mean you don't need a bowl? You have to mix it with water still. So we'll get back there, okay? But right now, they're assuming it's not mixed in a bowl. It only gets measured. Somehow, you add water. We don't know how magically. Okay, you add water, and it goes on the altar. And it goes, in the oven to bake. Now, it only becomes sanctified when it goes in the oven, according to Rabbi Akiva, because it doesn't get sanctified in the vessel, in the klei sharet, in the measuring thing, which is not a klei sharet. So there should be because the idea again being, unless it's sanctified, there's not going to be a prohibition to leaven it. So Shalach Ravin, it should be Ravin and not Rabbi Ruvain, or maybe it's Rabbi Ruvain, I don't know, there's different Yerses here. Mishmei de Rabbi Yochanan. Ravin was often someone who came to Babylonia from Israel and brought the Torah of Eretz Israel, so it makes sense, it was Ravin. Send the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Kachi Yatza'asho Mishnah. You're right the way the Mishnah says it. There's two drashot here. One says to include Menachot Nesachim, and one says to include Lechem hapanim. V'ipuch, but switch who said what. Okay? Rabbi Akiva must be the one who doesn't include lechem apanim, because according to him, there would be no prohibition. He must be the one to include the minchat nesachim. And as I said before, you'd have to say then, he's the one who holds that you can add water to it. Rabbi Yossi Aglili must think no water's added to the minchat nesachim, and therefore there's no prohibition there. But he holds that the midat yavesh were consecrated, the measuring utensils of dry ingredients, and therefore he holds that there's a prohibition for the lechem apanim. And that's the conclusion. Okay? But we're going to now we're going to read the hafuch. Asher taklivu lerabot lechem apanim lechimutz divrei Rabbi Yossi Aglili. He's the one who adds lechem apanim. Rabbi Akiva omer lerabot miminchat nesachim lechimutz. And Rabbi Akiva adds the libation one. Remember what the minchat nesachim are. They're the ones that go along with the korbanot. Va'az de Rabbi Yochanan l'tamei. Now we're going to say that Rabbi Yochanan is consistent with what he says because he says the following statement. Ta'am Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, which is the one who we just said, holds that, okay, let's say it in these words, what it included was the lechem apanim, because the midat yavesh were consecrated. Okay, because again, those things have to go hand in hand. And echad mitamidei Rabbi Yishmael amru davar echad. Okay, so Rabbi Yochanan was quoted as saying, or he said, that Rabbi Yossi Aglili and one of the students of Rabbi Yishmael, which we're going to see is Rabbi Yoshaya, Umanu Rabbi Yoshaya, said the same thing. Now what we're going to see is, in this machlokah between Rabbi Yoshaya and Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yoshaya is the one who holds that the dry ingredient measuring cups were sanctified, and Rabbi Yochanan thinks they were not. So basically what Rabbi Yochanan is saying is Rabbi Yossi Aglili and Rabbi Yoshaya say the same thing. It must be, that makes sense. The Rabbi Yochanan switched the gears here because he's the one who held, right? Rabbi Akiva is the one who thinks that they weren't sanctified. Rabbi Yossi Aglili thinks they were, and so does Rabbi Yoshaya. And that's why he said the two of them say the same thing. So now we're going to see where this comes from, this whole thing about the dry and the liquid ingredient measuring cups and how they were different. Titanya. Vayimshachem vayikadesh otam. When it talks about in Bamidbar chapter 7, verse 1, about the consecration of the temple, of the tabernacle, it says Moshe on that day, he vayimshach oto vayikadesh oto ve'ed kol kelav. Okay, he puts this oil on the mishkan, on the kelim, on the mizbech, and then it says vayimshachem vayikadesh otam. Okay, after it says he did it then says again, and he put the oil on them. By the way, the oil you put like an X, okay, the Greek key, okay, the Greek kaf. Vayimshachem vayikadesh otam. Okay, and then he sanctified them. So now Rabbi Yoshaya says, what does it mean vayikadesh otam? Midat halach. Okay, the assumption here that we're going to see later is the word otam seems to be limiting them, but not other things. So now what's the limitation? Midat halach, the liquid ingredients, nimshach bein mibifnim mein mibachutz. They were anointed, meaning you put the X in the middle of them, and they become sanctified on the inside and the outside. That either means that the rim, anything that gets to the rim but not inside the walls, will also be sanctified, or some say it's when things spill out and they touch the outside, right? Let's say you pour too much, so some never goes in, some just goes straight out and drips down the sides. That's also consecrated. Okay, that's what it means, beimi bifnim, beimi bachutz, whether inside or even if it's on the outside of the kli. But midat yavesh, what does otam comes to exclude? Is nimshach mi bifnim ve'ein nimshach mi bachutz. No matter what, everybody thinks the dry ones are different, but he thinks the dry ones are consecrated. Okay, they're sanctified vessels, but only what goes inside them, not what falls outside them. Okay? Rabbi Yochanan umel, and by the way, what do you see there? The Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Rabbi Yoshaya say the same thing, right? That's what Rabbi Yochanan was saying. That fits perfectly with what Rabbi Yochanan said by us, because Rabbi Yossi Aglili thinks the dry measure ingredient will sanctify what's inside of it, and that's why the isaron you measure for the lechem apanim is consecrated, which is why there's a prohibition then to leaven it. Rabbi Yochanan umel, midat halach nimshach mi bifnim ve'ein nimshach mi bachutz. Now he goes down a level for everything. He says the midat halach is consecrated, that was consecrated for anything that goes inside it, but not anything outside it. And midat yavesh lo nimshach kol ikal. And the dry measuring ingredients were never consecrated. Now, how does he prove this? Teda lecha sharei ein mekadeshet. How do we know it's not mekadeshet? Dichtiv. Now he quotes this pasuk about the shtei alechem. Okay, the 2 loaves of bread that are brought in the Shavuot offering. Mimoshvotechem taviu lechem tnufa shtayim. That's the 2 loaves. Shnei esronim solet tiena. Okay, you need 2 esronim of solet. Chametz te'afena. They will be baked as chametz, right? That's what's unique about those offerings. Bikurim laHashem. Now, notice where it says they're bikurim laHashem, only at the end of the pasuk. Comes Rabbi Yochanan and he says, Matayhem Lashem, when do they become to God? La'achal shenafu. It says they're baked and then they become bikurim Lashem. He learns in that pasuk they're only consecrated after they're baked. And that's where he assumes, now you finally understand why, that the dry ingredients were never, the dry measuring things were never sanctified. Because if they were, this would have been sanctified before the baking. Okay, this seems to say only after baking are they sanctified. Okay, and that's how he gets it. Now, b'mai kam b'flageh, what's the root of their machloket? Be'otam, how we understand this word otam, which is a limiting word, right? So they're anointed. These, not others. Well, Rabbi Yoshia savar otam lemute midat yavesh b'chutz, right? He says just the dry ones on the outside aren't, but everything else is. Rabbi Yochanan savar midat yavesh cholhu v'lo itzrich kra lemute. Rabbi Yochanan says the midat yavesh is not even talked about in this pasuk, because it's not even sacred at all. So of course it's not limited, it's just not there. Right? You don't limit something that's not relevant. Ki itzrich kra lemute. So if it's going to limit something, what's it limiting? Midat lach mi bachutz. The liquid measuring on the outside is what it's limiting. So now the Gemara just asks a side question, which is, if Rabbi Yochanan came and said that Rabbi Yossi Galili and one of the students of Rabbi Yishmael, namely Rabbi Yoshaya, say the same thing, why didn't he also say, Lema nami Rabbi Akiva v'cha mitamidei Rabbi Yishmael amru davar echad umanu Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, these were both students of Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yoshia. So why did Rabbi Yochanan also say that, on the other side we have Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yochanan who say the same thing? Why didn't he say that? Because they do agree. Well, we're now going to see they disagree about something. What do they agree about? That midade avesh lo nitkadsha, right? The dry measuring were never sanctified. What do they disagree about? Well, mishum de lo shavu b'midat lach lahadade. They disagree about the liquid. Rabbi Yochanan said the liquid, the otam, comes to limit that the liquid is only sanctified on the inside and not the outside. And the dry is not sanctified at all. Right? He kind of dropped a level from Rabbi Yoshia, but Rabbi Akiva holds two extremes. He says the dry is completely not sanctified and the liquid is completely sanctified, inside and outside. On that issue, he actually agrees with Rabbi Yoshia. So because of that, they weren't completely similar, and that's why he said they didn't say the same thing. Because they say the same thing about the dry, they don't say the same thing about the liquid. Okay, that's a complete side point. Now we get back to the question I told you we're going to ask before, which is, Amalei Rav Papa Labai. I don't understand this whole thing. Va'ikabisa, delachu. But you mix it in the bowl where liquid ingredients go, and that is obviously a sanctified vessel. In the end, you have to mix the flour with some water, and wouldn't it be obvious you do it in a bisa, and then it would be sanctified, and then you could say, yes, there's a prohibition to leaven it after you put it in that vessel. Amarle, so Abaye answers him, Kigon shalash al gabe katavlia. You could knead it on a flat tray. Okay, you ever knead dough, right? Theoretically, you can knead dough on something flat. So you could add the water to the flour on a flat surface, which would not be a sanctified vessel, and therefore that's why there's no prohibition, because it could be done without a sanctified vessel. It could be done with a sanctified. Basically what he's saying, and this is going to be important for the next stage, which is you have a choice. You could do it in a sanctified vessel. You could do it not in a sanctified vessel if you want. To which, Gemara says, wait. If you have an option to do two different, right, the same action in a sanctified vessel and non-sanctified vessel, what you're basically saying is it's up to the person to choose what they want to do. They could choose sanctified, they could choose not sanctified. Well, that leads us to a question on the discussion before between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yoshia. Rabbi Yochanan, where Rabbi Yochanan said, what was his whole proof about the dry ingredients? He said, right, the dry measuring are not sanctified. Remember, he said why? Because it said about the shtei alechem that they were baked, right? They were baked and then sanctified in the baking process and not earlier. Now, if you say that in the shtei alechem you could just choose, do you want to put it in a sanctified vessel or not? Well, Leimale, Rabbi Yoshaya could say, I could read that pasuk according to the one who's, according to the opinion, my opinion, which is dry measuring cups were sanctified. But if I have a choice, what could that pasuk be referring to? I could choose to either use a sacred dry ingredient measuring cup, or I could choose to, bring one from my house, which isn't, and use that one. Okay? He's basically saying, once you're giving people a choice, you could put it in a bisa, in this bowl, or you could put it on a katavlia, which is not sanctified. You could say the same thing with the dry one. And then your whole proof pasuk, I could reject. I could say, what do you mean? There were dry ones that were sanctified, And there are also dry ones that were around that weren't sanctified. And if you could choose which one you want to use, so go for it. So that's what we're going to see right here. Leimale, why? And the fact that Rabbi Yochanan didn't say this seems to imply you can't just choose what you want. Okay? Leimale kigon dechayla bisaron dechol. Why don't you just say, that pasuk is referring to a case where he decided to measure it in a non-sacred one that wasn't sanctified. But there are ones that are sanctified. To which the Gemara says, wait. You're making this analogy between whether you could choose a bisa or a katavlia to whether you could choose an isaron, a measuring, right, or a one isaron measuring cup that was sanctified or not sanctified. No, you can't compare those two. Hachiashta. Bishlama bisa, lo katav rachmana de la avi bisa lemelash be. Ki lashla gabe katavlia leit lamba. When it comes to the bisa, the Torah never said you have to mix it. It never says balul b'mayim, right? It never says this has to be mixed. Now, obviously, if you have to have water, you have to mix it. But Torah never commands us to mix it. So, and it never says you need a bisa to use it. So, therefore, you can choose. Use a bisa, use a katavlia, whichever one you want. But ela isaron, but the Torah says you need an isaron. Now, how are you going to get an isaron if you don't measure it? Right? Now, if Rabbi Yochanan wants to say, well, you could choose to measure in a sanctified one or a non-sanctified one, or again, the Gemara is trying to say, Rabbi Yochanan could have said this if that were really true, that you can choose. No, Isaron, you can't choose, even if you could choose Katavli or Abisa. Okay, V'anda Amar Rachmana, Avid Isaron Chayabes, since Torah said, take an Isaron and measure it, Shavik Isaron de Kodesh v'chayal b'Isaron de Chol. Right, we would leave the Isaron of Kodesh and measure it in Isaron of Chol. You can't do that. There's no way you could use non-sanctified measuring cup. So that's not really such a question. Okay, moving on now to the next braita. Tanu Rabbanan. Minayin l'ma'alem mi basar. Okay, now we're focusing on the end of that pasuk. The pasuk we focused on today was kol mincha asher tekrivu la'Hashem lo te'aseh chametz ki kol se'or v'chol dvash lo taktiru mimenu ishel Hashem. Now, don't make a chametz because you can't use chametz, you can't use honey on the altar. Then it says, though, we learned this drasha already, lo taktiru mimenu is an extra thing. It should have just said lo taktiru. What's mimenu? Teaches you that if you burned part of something, like the komets, let's say, and you have the shirayim left over, the shirayim were part of the whole thing, you separated out the komets and the shirayim, anything where you burned part of it, the rest of it can never be burned on the altar. That's a prohibition that comes out of this pasuk, and that's the one we're talking about right now. So minayin l'ma'alem mi basar chatan, mi basar hasham, mi basar kodesh kodeshim, mi kodshim kalim, mi motor omer, mi motor shtei alechem, mi lechem apanim, shirei menachot, shehu b'lo ta'aseh. How do we know that all the following things, which are all items, meat of sacrificial offerings, where we burnt the imurim and now you're supposed to eat the meat, or you burned some of the mincha and you're allowed to eat the rest of it? How do we know that if what's left we burn on the altar, you're liable? How do we learn that? Because of this pasuk. Okay, Talmud Lamal, ki kol se'or v'chol dvash lo taktiru mimenu isha Hashem, kol shu mimenu la'ishim, when it says mimenu isha, anyone from something went on the fire, the rest of it, hareyu bebal taktiru, the rest of it can't go on the fire. So now they say, wait, there's a problem with two of these. Shtei alechem v'lechem apanim, yesh mehem la'ishim, v'hatanya, okay, shtei alechem and lechem apanim, so shtei alechem and lechem apanim are both completely eaten by the kohanim. None of it is burned. Why are they on this list? Okay, it doesn't make any sense because they were in the Braita. Doesn't it say in the Braita these are excluded from this prohibition because none of it gets burned on the fire? You're right that no part of the lechem apanim or no part of the shtei lechem gets burned, but the sacrifice that goes with it, okay, we'll see what it is, but with the shtei lechem there's the two kvasim, the two sheep. They get burned, so it's connected with that, and therefore they're forbidden to go on the altar. And with the lechem apanim, remember there's this bizichei levona, the bowls of frankincense that get burned. So there's something with it. It's true, nothing of them goes on the flame, but other parts of them go on the fire, and therefore the rest of them, they are completely not permitted either. Okay, now we get to one last issue here. Itmar. There's a machloket about this. Hamalemi kulam agabe kevesh. I told you before, when you put it on the altar, maybe it's like burning it. What about the ramp? What if I'm not allowed to burn any of these items? What if I put them on the ramp? Is that considered that I violated this prohibition or not? Rabbi Yochanan amar chayav, Rabbi Elazar amar patul. Now they're going to darshan this from the next pasuk, which we haven't read yet. After it says, don't bring these things on the altar, it says, korban reshit takrivu otam laHashem. Bring your first korban could be. What's your first korban? It means on Shavuot, you can bring dvash because the bikurim are fruits, right? The tamarim are like honey, the dates, and the shtei alechem is chametz. So once a year, okay, your first one of the year, you can bring like this, but don't offer them up on the altar. So now they say, okay, now the question is this. When we say, Titania mizbech, ein li'ala mizbech, it says don't put them on the altar. Kevesh minayin, Talmud lamar, ela mizbech lo ya'alu. There's different ways of how we get it from this pasuk, but lo ya'alu, how do you get up the mizbech? By the ramp. So lo ya'alu includes even the ramp. Okay, that's one way of reading it. So now they're saying, now I want you to remember, because the next pasuk, the next drasha we're going to see understands this whole thing differently, and that's why I want to get this straight, and then we're going to finish here. We started with this pasuk which said, don't put seor, chametz and seor on the altar. And then we darshan from there that this also applies to anything that got burned, don't put the other part of it on the altar, right? The rest of it. This next pasuk is really talking about seor and dvash, but it could also be talking about the lo taktiru. So the first opinion says it's also talking about the lo taktiru prohibition, and it says don't put it anywhere, right? Even lo ya'alu, even on the ramp. But Rabbi Elazar Amar Patur, my time, Adam requests seor dvash. He says the main focus of that pasuk is the seor dvash. Those are the things. Korban reshit takrivu otam. Otam hu derabi lacha kevesh k'mizbech. Avamidi achrini lo. The next pasuk really ignores the extra part. If you burn part of it, don't bring the remainder on the altar. The next pasuk was really bringing it back to, we're really talking about the seor and dvash. So when it says, don't put these on the altar, right, only once a year, it means even on the ramp you can't bring chametz or dvash. But it's not talking about that extra prohibition that we derive from the lo taktiru mimenu ishel Hashem. So that's the machlokah between them, and here we're going to end for today. Okay, so it's a big daf. We have a lot of things to review, but I'll try to do it quickly. We started with the Masechet Shabbat issue and how putting the leavening agent into and having it go on its own, it's like Shabbat where you're going to be chayav anyway. We got into a whole thing, when are you chayav in Shabbat and in which situations. Then we started with the drasha in the beginning part of the episode, Kol, Hamincha, Yakrivu, La Hashem. We had all these different drashot, and we spent a lot of time specifically on the Asher Takrivu, which included either the Menchat Nesachim or the Lechem HaPanim, and then we had to see why each one included that one or the other. We had to switch the Shittot because it didn't match one of the opinions, Rabbi Akiva's opinion in the other Mishnah about the Midat HaYavesh being sanctified, and through that we understood what the whole basis of the Machloket is, right? Could there really be an issue in the Menchat Nesachim because they don't even have water in them, or maybe they do? And Lechem HaPanim, is it even sanctified before or not, depending on what you hold about the Midat Yavesh? And if it's not sanctified, then there's no problem of leavening it. So that was the big debate there. And then we finished with this issue of the Mimenu, Taktir Mimenu, which is that extra prohibition. If part of it, then you can't burn the rest of it on the altar. And then we had, what if you put them on the ramp? And we ended with a machloket about that. With that, we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day.